So, welcome everyone to our Wales Regional Conference 2021. Thank you for coming to all of our speakers who are here today, as well as people who bought tickets and are on the live stream and so on. It's going to be a very good day of sort of talks and conversations with people of different areas of reporting in Wales. And yeah, it's going to be really exciting. We've got for our first session Liz Perkins, who is from the South Wales Evening Post, who is going to talk to us sort of about her career and advice she's got for our members, as well as how to sort of put yourself forward for awards, which I know is always exciting for our members. So yeah, first of all, welcome, Liz.
Really nice to meet you.
Thank you. My first question is sort of basically about your training, your background. How did you get into journalism to begin with?
Well, I actually went to become a journalist when I was 13, and I was very determined that that is what I was going to do. So I researched it and researched all the different universities, and I ended up doing an English literature degree at Kingston University. And I decided that I was going to do a postgraduate diploma, and it was either going to be at City or Cardiff. So I ended up getting into Cardiff University and did the course there. I think anybody who's done that course over the years will tell you it's probably one of the toughest courses around. And when I was there, it was a bit like an army boot camp, really. It was very much, deadlines were important, accuracy was important. And if you were too late arriving for lectures, that door would be shut and you would be begging to come in. So it was a real, quite a tough sort of course, but it put me in good stead. I learned so much, obviously everything from shorthand to public admin, and really how to be everything from a news editor to a journalist and a sub. So yeah, it was worth doing for sure.
Yeah. Did you sort of find that doing a master's was more beneficial than just sort of going straight into the industry, as it were?
I think, that was something I felt I needed to do in order to get into the industry. I mean, I did spend some time in the Carmarthen Journal actually for about, I think it was like 3 months. And it was good training, it was good experience, but it was just, I thought, right, let's just do this and let's get places like, the Llanelli Star and all these type of places under my belt. But really, I thought if you went to somewhere like Cardiff, they're very well connected. So I got to do like work experience with The Guardian and The Times and places like that. And I did do some experience with The Independent beforehand, but it took me an entire year to actually get through the door there. And you just think somewhere like Cardiff really sort of almost like paves the way to get into the nationals quite early. And that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So did you think it was, how was your experience of sort of getting those first steps into sort of, I suppose, professional journalism after you'd graduated?
Well, to be honest, I mean, before I went to Cardiff, I was one of the few people who actually had 7 different places on my CV in terms of going to lots of different newspapers, because I thought this is the way I'm going to get in, And afterwards, I mean, it was quite straightforward, because once you've done Cardiff, I did get a job later on in the South Wales Evening Post and obviously Wales Online now. And it was worth doing. I mean, obviously Cardiff's got a very strong reputation, and what you find is if you go to a university like that, you've got lots of people who went there, who are in different places, whether that's a national or regional level, and they know how good it is. So you've probably got more chance in actually getting in and getting on because of it. But yeah, I mean, obviously, the opportunities I had at the Evening Post have done all sorts of different things, from like health reporting, defence reporting, and general news reporting. So that kind of gave me the grounding to do what I do today, really.
Yeah. Do you think doing such a mix of different things, like you just said, health reporting, news reporting, defence reporting, has really helped sort of shape you as a journalist and sort of helped you along in your career?
I think it's better to do a general news first of all, because then you know that whatever situation happens, whether you're dealing with a terror attack or whether you're dealing with something more mundane, you can deal with anything at all and then go on to specialise. I wouldn't recommend specialising straight away, because you're almost putting yourself in almost pigeonholing yourself, you know.
Yeah.
And I just think it's better just to give yourself the opportunity to meet lots of different people and just experience a lot of different things. And you definitely grow as a journalist, that's for sure.
Yeah. How do you you've just talked about specializing a little bit. How do you sort of how do you make that progression towards a specialism, and how do you decide sort of what's for you, and how do you start working towards that?
Well, in terms of health reporting, I mean, the job just came up and I thought, you know, this is a good time to just move on and do something a bit different. I knew that I could take on a campaign that we were doing at the paper at the time. It was over neurosurgery and trying to keep that department open in Morrison Hospital. And, you know, I just thought, well, I've got an interest in this. Let's just give this a go. And it went well. But defence reporting, I mean, I kind of fell into that by accident because what happened when I was health reporting was that the Ministry of Defence just randomly phoned up one day and said, we've got all these health workers in Afghanistan in a, you know, hospital in Camp Bastion. Would you like to go? And it was just one of those random phone calls that takes you on a different journey and a different path. So yeah. I never would have imagined that for 1 second. But yeah, you've got to be open-minded, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, you've just mentioned that you went to Afghanistan, and you told me before we went live that you've been out there 6 times.
Yeah.
So what was your experience out there? How was it? Because obviously that's something that quite a lot of journalists will never get the opportunity to do.
Well, absolutely.
How was it?
It was incredible, actually, because I was running my own news agenda. I didn't really have a news editor out there telling me what to do. I had lots of different experiences, actually. I mean, the first time I went out there, I was in Camp Bastion for the whole visit. And I got to meet the health workers who were actually there. But I mean, a month beforehand, you know, they had a bomb going off near the hospital. And there was risk involved, obviously. I mean, at one time when I arrived at Kandahar airport, the siren was going off, the alarms were going off, and we had to literally jump under the table because the airport was under attack. And, you know, they were firing missiles towards it, the Taliban were. And you just have to be calm. You have to listen to what they tell you. You're putting on your body armor and your helmet. And it's really strange. You actually react in a quite a calm way because that's what you've been taught to do. And yeah, you just never know what you're going to get. I mean, I went on the ground in Nadali and Babaji with the troops. And I got to go out in the massive vehicles, which if anybody looks it up on Google, they're quite impressive. And one day we just had to stop. And there were people who actually found the inside of a bomb and they brought it over to the British troops. And that was quite something. I mean, there's been times when I've been waiting to go off in a helicopter and suddenly you hear an explosion. And you know that war was very much real. I remember interviewing some troops out in a patrol base, and in the background you could just hear this gunfire. And there's an area of Afghanistan called the Dash, and basically it was the Taliban firing. And one of the guys said to me, have you ever been in a base when the Taliban took it over? And I was like, no, but there's always a first time. It didn't happen, but you just don't know what's going to happen. It's just obviously really exciting. It's obviously very dangerous as well. But, you know, it's an experience that I'll never forget, and a really great opportunity. And I've got, you know, exclusive interviews that ended up appearing in the nationals as well, you know. So it was great for me. And, you know, well, you were never going to turn down the opportunity to be part of one of the biggest news stories in the world at that point in time. So, yeah, and I was on a regional newspaper. So you'd never really imagine that you'd do that there. But sometimes opportunities come your way that you don't really expect.
Yeah. Is it an opportunity that you'd sort of like to take again if it ever arose? Yeah, obviously we're not in a position at the minute where that would be an opportunity. But if it did, is it something you'd like to, you know, do again?
Part of me would, but part of me feels like I'm kind of on a different path at the moment. I mean, I'm doing news editing as well now, and I kind of think, you know, I've had an incredible opportunity in Afghanistan. I don't know whether I'll ever go back to a war zone, but I kind of feel like I've done so much with the army and you know, our forces, and got to see Cyprus and Canada and all the rest of it. Now I kind of see myself probably going forward in terms of being, you know, like a news editor and going down that route, I think.
Yeah. so obviously after that you came back and you now work full time pretty much in Wales. So how did you sort of make that transition? How did you find it from doing something which is obviously, you know, a really unique experience and as you said, something quite exciting to that big change in your sort of working patterns? How did you sort of make that? How did you find it?
I think it's quite difficult actually, because one minute, you know, you're in the middle of a desert, you're seeing people wandering around with camels, and there's like, you know, having a bar of chocolate would be a big deal, or having a shower or whatever in some of these places because there's nothing there. And then you come back and you're walking in Tesco's, and it just feels like the most surreal thing ever. And I don't really know how troops cope with the transition between being in a war zone and then coming back. I mean, one of my friends, I mean, she found it really difficult. And, you know, every time a car would backfire, she felt like she'd have to just go on the ground and just in case she was going to be under attack. So some people could have a really, you know, negative, it can have a negative impact. I mean, obviously for me, it was more, what do I do now to replace this? Because it's so exciting. How you just can't replace it, you know, it's just so different. I think it took me a while to get back into what I was doing on a day-to-day, really.
Yeah. But obviously you're all sort of settled back now, and so yeah, and you're back working on sort of a specialist role as well as news editing on a regional paper. Why do you think those sort of roles are important? Because a lot of I hope you all want me to say, but the local sort of paper industry is quite underfunded, and a lot of papers might not be able to afford sort of defence reporters like you are. Why do you think those roles are actually really important for sort of representing the communities and ensuring people, you know, senior figures on a regional level are held to account?
I think, you know, the first thing to be clear on is that, you know, it's the Ministry of Defence who actually pay for those trips. So it's not the newspaper who actually pay for it. So that's why I was able to actually go. I think you need to have a mixed bag of reporters in terms of different regional papers, because obviously everything is important to cover. And, you know, the forces are a great form of stories. I mean, they always have been. I mean, you know, the story that's recently in the news was the veteran Captain Tom, who passed away quite sadly. But, you know, he was somebody who embodies what the forces is all about. And, you know, maybe we're not at war at the moment, but somehow, in you know, some point down the track, then probably we will be. But if you look at the coronavirus crisis, you can see the military have got such a role in it. You know, yes, they're supporting the government, but they're the ones who are sort of looking at it in a logistic way. They're used to dealing with this kind of thing. And, you know, it is still crucial, it's still important. And, you know, our forces will always have a role in our society, and it's important to write about them and really show that the country backs them in what they're doing, especially now in this crisis.
Yeah. How have you how did you sort of build up contacts throughout? Because obviously there is sort of national security implications of reporting on the armed force and that. So how did you sort of find it trying to build up that contacts book that enables you to write these stories? Did you find it quite difficult as opposed to perhaps reporting on other areas?
People learn to trust you. I think that's the crucial thing. People get to know you. I mean, obviously, they're not that too many women actually doing this job. So it makes you kind of stand out. They realize who you are. They've seen you before, and they'll say, oh, yeah, she does a really good job. And when people actually know that you are going to write a reasonable story, that you're not suddenly going to come out with something that doesn't represent them, then the doors open. It's just when you start writing things that are negative. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, there was a guy who was writing all sorts of negative stories. And the next minute, you know, he was on the next plane home. So this is how you really have to work hard to get people on board. It's not always easy. People don't necessarily want to speak to you. I mean, sometimes you've got people who died out in Afghanistan and their families. I mean, do you really want to speak to a journalist or not? I mean, some people do. Some people want to pay tribute to their loved ones, but sometimes no. It's a hard thing to do, trying to win people's trust, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So how have you found that sort of the pandemic has impacted on sort of your working practices, but also just your just your sort of job in general in terms of trying to find stories and get them out? Have you found?
It's really different. Yeah, really different. In the past, you just literally walk up the street, you'd speak to somebody, you'd get your story. Now it's very much right. Let's look at Twitter, let's look at Facebook, let's look at Instagram, and try and find stories that way. But the thing is, you've got all these other journalists who are trying to do exactly the same thing, and you're trying to find something that's original, that's different, and that is the challenge at the moment. I mean, obviously, you can do interviews via Zoom, which is amazing. But yeah, it's totally revolutionized everything, our working practices, the whole thing. And actually, we could end up working from home in the future. You never know. So it's something that you've got to get used to. You've got to adapt. I mean, that's the trick about journalism is if you want to survive the industry, you've got to go with the changes. You've got to learn lots of skills and not be afraid to do different things, whether it's broadcasting or whether it's papers or whether it's online. Just embrace every opportunity, really.
Yeah. Do you think it provides sort of an opportunity for young journalists? So obviously, like you said, you're having to do interviews over Zoom. Everyone's sort of looking for the same stories on social media. Do you think it provides an opportunity for young journalists that they might not have had before because they didn't have the same level of access to stuff before the virus hit us now? Do you think that sort of is an opportunity that young journalists need to take?
I think that they're probably already taking it, because the thing is, that's how they operate anyway. So it was almost like people who maybe have been in the industry for longer, who are used to knocking on somebody's door or whatever, they've had to change. Whereas if you're a young journalist in like college or university now, that's what you do. You look at Twitter, you look at every form of social media out there, and whether you see some great video on TikTok or whatever it is, you think, oh, great, that's the story. And I think sometimes it's a re-education of seasoned journalists instead. So yeah, it's a good opportunity definitely for them.
Yeah. I've definitely seen a sort of a big uptick of our members in like trying to get into freelancing in the last year. Do you have any sort of advice for how they should go about those first steps in their career, even whether it's freelancing they want to get into or sort of being a staff writer like you?
I think you just got to be determined and just keep on trying. There's a lot of good like groups out there as well for different journalists on Facebook. And there's also, you can get like freelance emails coming through just saying what jobs are available and that kind of thing. So if anybody wants any advice on that, just let me know, because I think it's Sean Meads who actually sends that out. So that's quite helpful. And you should really be following different accounts on social media. I think it's Media Monitor is one of them. I mean, they always put out job alerts and things, and obviously Indeed and Gokana as well. So it's just a case of keeping an eye out, but you've got to push, because the thing is, given their situation now, that obviously people have lost jobs, you've got more competition as journalists, and just keep on knocking the door, but be aware. I mean, obviously there is that competition out there, but don't give up.
Yeah. It is a very competitive industry. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how people can stand out? Because obviously there'll be lots of people coming out of university every year with a great degree and having done stuff on like their student paper and stuff like that. How do people sort of stand out amongst all the other CVs and cover letters being sent in? Not just things like shorthand, I imagine.
No, yeah, of course.
Also, other things that they've sort of done off their own back and so on.
The challenge is right now is trying to get experience anywhere, because obviously offices are not working in the same way as they were, and neither are businesses. So how do you get that experience when we're in a lockdown? That is the trick, and that is the thing. I mean, you probably got more chance of actually getting that in terms of websites, because they're going to be operating in a different way. So it's just a case of plugging away and just seeing what's out there. Thing is, I mean, you've obviously got social media that you can use to promote yourself and promote your work. So sometimes you'll get a story maybe on a different website, and why not use that as a means of doing things? I always think that LinkedIn is a good way of just like becoming friends with people, connected with people that maybe you would never really have met, and it's a chance for them to actually see your work. So that's always worth a go as well.
Yeah. If any of the people watching on the live stream want to ask any questions for Liz, there is a comments box or a chat box on our live stream, so stick them in there and we'll keep an eye on them. And if anyone has any sort of questions or sort of burning things they're wondering about, please put them in there and we'll make sure Liz answers them. But in the meantime, I'll carry on with some of my questions. So, where do you sort of see local and regional media going next? Because obviously, this last year has been a big reset for them. Obviously, a bit greater focus on online things in terms of events as well as sort of reporting practices. So, where do you see sort of local going from here?
I think really online is the big thing for regional outlets, really. I mean, obviously you can see that the sales of newspapers are falling, and I think over time then, I imagine that they're probably going to be either vastly reduced or phased out, because I think everybody, when they if you're into journalism, you probably look at your phone first thing in the morning and you're reading different websites to get your news. And that's probably the way it's going to go. I mean, obviously we rely on a lot of video as well as online stories as well. So, I mean, I think that it's just going to be the growth of that, and almost using your website to do lots of different things, in terms of whether you're broadcasting a story or whatever. I think that really is going to be where it's at. And that's why I think that multi-skilled journalists are the ones who really will survive the industry, because you need to have a lot of different skills, and just don't just say, oh, I just want to write, so I just want to do this. Just say yes to everything, and you'll be able to do well in the industry.
Yeah. Have you done much of that sort of multimedia stuff, like video and so on? Is that something that you've been doing more of in the last sort of few years?
I have done bits of video as well, actually, yeah. And I've done more radio recently, actually, as well. So that's been really good too. Yeah, it's just a different opportunity, and I think it's definitely worth taking. But yeah, it's just, like I say, you've got to be able to adapt, and that's crucial. Just don't pigeonhole yourself at all.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what's quite good about most modern journalism courses, especially masters, that they recognise this and they are sort of gearing people towards, even if they have a chosen sort of strand of the industry, that to give them the skills to do that and sort of the other things that the industry might ask them to do. So going into a newsroom and writing stories, but also being asked, can you go out and film this piece to camera? I think that's something that masters courses are definitely focusing on, which is good.
Yeah, it's important, isn't it?
Yeah. As well as you work with sort of Wales Online, the South Wales Evening Post, you do write quite a bit for nationals, I believe. How do you sort of get into that? Because it's quite a daunting thing, especially for young journalists, to sort of start pitching as well as doing shifts. So do you have any advice for sort of getting into it and sort of getting that step ahead?
I managed to actually get some shifts. It started doing some shifts at the Daily Star, and they basically, once you start doing that, then I ended up getting shifts at the Sunday Mirror, and you sort of build up to different places, and got into the Daily Express. I ended up there being asked to go into the news desk, and really that I just thought it was a great opportunity to do it. So sometimes you just got to start out in different places, maybe sometimes places that you don't necessarily think that you were going to end up in. I'd just say yes. But what I would suggest is just send your CV out to lots of different, just email it in to lots of different news editors or head of news editors, and just give it a go, because sometimes they'll just say yes, and just go for it. I mean, sometimes the hours are quite antisocial. I don't get me wrong. I've done work till 2 a.m. and all sorts of things when most of the world's asleep, but it is worth doing. And just you do have to do things that other people don't necessarily want to do to get in, and once you're in, then obviously you'll get into another newspaper or website or whatever it is you want to do. It's the option is there to move on. And I think the shifts, people never really tell you about these shifts at all when you're when you're in college and all the rest of it. But I think that is the best way to get your foot through the door, and you never know what's going to happen after that. You may even get a job. So
yeah. Yeah, you've just touched on how most people don't know that much about shifts, and I think I'm sort of I'm also on that. I don't really know what shifts are about. Does it involve more sort of finding stories, or is it editing other people's work?
you basically go in and you write stories during the time that you're in, rather than editing. You get more responsibility as you go. So it depends on the nature of what you do, because you can get a reporting shift or you can get news desk shifts or whatever it is. And, it's a case of wait and see what happens and, in terms of your career. But yeah, I would say it's a good opportunity just to get known and get seen. And somebody, if they like you, they'll definitely give you a job. So yeah, it's a good thing to do.
Yeah. A lot of people have sort of preferred papers that they'd like to write for. Is that something that you think people can afford to do? Obviously, it's quite a competitive industry. So do you think it's something people can sort of try and do? Say, yes, I'd like to write for this paper, or do they need to sort of try and go for all, just send out their CV to everyone and see who bites in a way?
I think you're right. It is about sending your CV out to everybody and see who comes back. Because thing is, you can have a dream of working for a certain newspaper, but maybe that won't come off. So it's always better to have options, isn't it? Very important.
Yeah, definitely. How have you found that sort of working on local sort of regional press and working on national press has differed?
It is really different. I mean, obviously, I guess with staffing levels and things like that sometimes. But you're looking at a completely different agenda but there is a bit of a crossover as well, because certain issues are in the news and you may be working on something like that for a national newspaper. And at the same time, it's still relevant to people across Wales, So you do have that core news values that are the same, but obviously, they're not going to go into the same. Nationals will just do the story once, whereas a regional will probably go to do the story, revisit that story, and then do another follow-up. But sometimes follow-ups are actually better than your first story on an issue. So it's always worth staying in touch with people and keeping on going.
Yeah. How do you when you've got a national story that you obviously want to make local, how do you sort of go about that and make sure it is relevant to that local audience in a way that they'll sort of want to read and say, this is this big national story, and here's how it affects your readers in South Wales? How do you sort of approach that?
I think basically, just so you know, I mean, at the moment, the domestic abuse bill is going through Parliament. So if you want to make it relevant to Wales, then obviously you'd find somebody living in Wales who has been through a harrowing ordeal, who's prepared to speak about it. And then you would get them to tell their story and say why they need the law to be changed in Britain. And that is how you localize it and how you change it, because it makes, and especially if it's an awful ordeal and people are prepared to talk about that, then obviously an online audience will be interested in reading it, and and a paper audience as well. So it changes everything.
Yeah, it's probably also important to remember that when there is so much digital and online, it's stuff does transcend the local area that it's sort of aimed for. I'm always seeing stuff for the Evening Standard in London, or the Sheffield Star. So I think it is important to sort of realise that not everyone who reads it will be from that locale as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Going back to sort of your work as a defence reporter, are there any skills that you think that you've learned that are transferable from the specialism? So up to to people either in other specialisms or just general news journalism?
I think I learned to do everything in that job, because you weren't just writing stories, you were having to do film footage of the troops on the ground, you're having to do all sorts of different things. You're having to almost become your own news editor in a way and decide what was the best story of the day, because it's really difficult to communicate from there. And you would have laughed, because I had this one guy who was having to make sure the satellite dish was working, and I was there with a torch trying to write emails, and he was making sure that worked for me to be able to send it. So it's just, you have to learn to be multi-skilled at somewhere like that and just adapt. And I think the ability to do that is really what's put me in good stead elsewhere.
Yeah. And defence is quite something that's quite, it can be quite a complex subject matter. Especially if people who aren't that much of an expert in it, as I would not be. So how do you sort of boil it down and make it something that people can understand and connect with and understand how it impacts them?
I think really the one thing about any news story is it's always usually about a person. And if you sit down and talk to, whether it's a soldier or whether it's a captain or whoever it is, whatever rank, they're a person at the end of the day. And yeah, okay, you've got all these different vehicles and you've got all these different planes and all the rest of it that people probably wouldn't necessarily know. But when somebody starts talking about what it's like to actually be in a war zone, and sometimes their best friend is being killed or whatever it is, I mean, any one of us can identify with that, and telling the human story is always very important in those circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to talk about sort of your awards, because in a few months, and this is a cheeky SPA plug, we have our national awards coming up for all of our members. So if you are watching and you're interested in putting yourselves forward for them, this is something that might interest you. Liz, you've obviously won and been nominated for quite a lot of awards in your career. How have you sort of built up the confidence and experience to sort of keep putting yourself forward for awards? Because that's something our members aren't. A lot of our members are still right to the start of their career, and obviously they put themselves forward for our awards, but they are quite often eligible for sort of the British Journalism Awards and stuff as well. Yeah. So how do you build up like the confidence to put yourself forward?
I just think you should just see it as an opportunity, really. Sometimes you may not get nominated or you may not win. But the one thing that does happen is that the judges, who are often, national newspaper editors or have been there, basically are the ones who are looking at the entries that come in. So you may not necessarily win or get shortlisted, but you're getting seen. And I personally think that really is the most important thing sometimes, because I've entered awards in the past where I didn't think that I was going to get nominated. And, I've been nominated 2 years in a row for the British Journalism Awards, because I just thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a go and just see. And if it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But you've got to try, because how is anybody going to get to know you? How are you going to get a job? How are you going to get seen? And I think getting seen really is vital. So if anybody is thinking of entering your awards and are just a bit concerned about it, well, just give it a go, because you don't know who's reading and where that's going to lead you to, because winning an award with you guys could end up winning an award at a regional press awards one day, or like I say, the British Journalism Awards or national press awards. You just don't know. And I just think it's always worth promoting yourself, because that's the key thing to do.
Yeah. Well, the important things to like focus on, so say you're given 400 words to say why your story or your campaign was better than everyone else's. What are the important things that you'd sort of focus on to show why that is the case?
I think you've got to be aware that people don't know anything about your campaign. So basically, sometimes what they do is they're quite good like this, is that they do like Zoom calls and tell you what they're looking for. And they say, we're looking for something different. We want something standout. We want something we've never seen before. And you think, oh, okay, well, I've got this angle to it. And that sometimes is helpful, but always read the instructions. I know it sounds ridiculous thing to say, but some people don't really look at that properly. But really, that's what they want. They're basically telling you, we want you to tell us, have you changed British law? Have you done something that nobody else has done? And tell them. So if it's an exclusive, say it's an exclusive, or that's quite a key thing, is just to say, no other newspaper or online outlet has ever done anything like this before, that I'm doing it, and it's I've achieved this, and this person said this about the campaign, and who you've got involved, and whether that's Rachel Riley of Countdown, or whether that's an MP or whoever it is, showing the scale of support for it. and how you're doing things differently for everybody else, and it sets you apart.
Yeah. What are the sort of top do's and don'ts you could give us sort of advice for journalists who are about to start their career? Because a lot of the people watching, I imagine, are sort of a couple of years away from starting their own careers. What are the top sort of do's as well as don'ts that you could give them?
I think you've always got to make sure that you're accurate in your reporting, and that's such a key thing, because especially people who end up on websites, the most complaints are always about, oh, the headline's wrong, or this word is wrong, or whatever. And you can be quick, but you've got to be right. And you don't land yourself into legal trouble, and you've got to be careful on those kind of things. But yeah, that's like, you've always got to think of that, because that's a major deal. And also be determined about things, because jobs aren't necessarily going to land on a plate for you. And I guess in times like this, if you're quite tough about things and just keep on going, then you will get through and keep on pushing on. But I will say too, I mean, it helps the people that you get to know along the way, because you never know. Sometimes they'll see you and think, oh yeah, I may not be able to give them a job now, but I can give them a job in a couple of years' time. You just don't know. So it does pay to stay in touch with people, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people have said throughout our regional conferences this week that one of the big things they recommend is sort of every few months getting back in touch with the people, and just reminding them that you exist and sort of what
absolutely.
you do and that and so on.
And even if it's just to say hi, I mean, thing is, you just don't know, maybe they'll say, oh yeah, we've got something now, because it's not going to stay like this forever, especially with the vaccine rollout. So you've got to be quick about getting in touch with people, because otherwise somebody else is going to step in, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. Is local sort of like a really, do you think it's a easier route in perhaps for people who are just starting out their careers? Do you think sort of getting in touch with their local paper might be one of the perhaps more accessible routes that they can take?
I think what you're seeing now is that, I mean, obviously you're getting a lot of students who are just going on national websites because it's an easy way to get in. But I would say that it does help going on regionals, because obviously when you're starting out, it's just a good grounding. Do you know what I mean? It's just, you get to do absolutely all sorts of everything. But at the same time, I could understand if somebody thinks, oh, I wouldn't mind getting a web job somewhere. I completely get that, and why they want to bypass it. But it depends what you're looking to do. It does offer you a different opportunity, that's for sure. And sometimes you get to do more things at regional level that you ever imagine, and you probably won't get to do a national level. So yeah, it's definitely an opportunity to consider, for sure.
Yeah. Well, because it is really important to ensure that local journalism is sort of its role in holding sort of senior figures to account is maintained, as well as representing the individuals in that locale.
Absolutely. I think that's what the worry is that people in journalism aren't necessarily holding people to account in the manner that they should, because there's obviously less journalists out there now, and the type of journalism they're doing as well, they may not necessarily look at that. I mean, obviously there's still a role for investigative journalism, and looking at the local authority and police and all the rest of it, to ensure that they're doing their job. Basically, that's what we're about. We're meant to be there to hold people to account, and not to be scared of that.
Yeah. Well, and we certainly see at the SPA, and I'm not sure if it's the same for you in local journalism, that sometimes some of the biggest stories won't get exposed unless one of the quote unquote smaller papers does it. Like, for example, a few months ago we saw the Mancunian, which is obviously the University of Manchester's paper, reporting on students being sort of locked in their halls by security staff, which then made it national. But might not have done if they hadn't done the hard work to sort of get that done. Is that something you see with sort of local and regional press as well?
Definitely. I did some stories around the DVLA, and I've been writing about them for months in Swansea. And basically, that now has gone national, that there was all these cases. And you think, I've been doing it for so long, and raising, that are almost putting the spotlight on them. and showing that really what was happening. There shouldn't have been all these cases there. I mean, obviously the DVLA were trying to say, you know, they'd put all this different measures in place, but the Nationals have also picked this up as well now, because obviously most of us are working from home, and yet, you know, it's a government agency and these people are still going into the office. I will say, I mean, obviously not all jobs can be done from your living room. I'm obviously quite lucky in that respect, but there's been a huge amount of criticism of the DVLA in their handling of the crisis. So we'll see what happens next with that. I know that they were taking it to the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, as well. So we'll you know, it's quite interesting to see that. But it's, you know, I mean, I had stories about Ford that they were going to close before, and I found out before all the nationals that was going to happen. The next day it went national. So you can get really strong, really good stories at regional level that do get picked up. I mean, I did an investigation on prostitution that ended up winning an award. It happened in Swansea, and talking to prostitutes and what they've been through. And, you know, most people will just walk past them and they're invisible. But yeah, that got picked up by Sky News, Channel 5. They went to do programs about what the situation was. And, you know, so if it wasn't for regional reporters shining the spotlight, you wouldn't necessarily see half these stories, like you say, in Manchester or anywhere else in the national press. You're quite right.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I think that's a really important lesson for sort of those watching to take, that even if you think people might not be interested in something at a national level, you should report on it anyway, because, you know, you never know what's going to sort of connect and make that sort of leap to a national story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Please keep putting questions in the chat if you have any for Liz. But I've got my last question, which is one we've been asking all this week, which is, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever got in your career?
Oh, wow. I think it's just to be determined. Just be determined and never give up, because you just don't know where it's going to take you. I mean, sometimes you feel like the doors are not necessarily opening for you, but just don't ever give up.
Yeah, definitely. Right, so thank you, Liz, for coming to sort of talk to our regional conference. That was really interesting. I learned a lot. I definitely didn't already know about local journalism, as well as sort of specialisms within that. But the fun doesn't stop there with our regional conference. In 15 minutes, or actually closer to 18 minutes, we're hearing from Ben Black from Cumbrian Life about sort of hyperlocal reporting, as well as juggling that alongside a day-to-day job, which I'm sure a lot of our students come journalists can sort of relate to. So please join us for that, for what's sure to be a really interesting session. Thank you, Liz, for coming to talk to us. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
And it was great to hear from you. Have a great day, everyone. And yes, we'll see you in, now it's 17 minutes. Goodbye.
See ya.
All right. We're out.